It's not it. Thank you. A little blue thing spinning. Okay, share the screen. And away we go. Welcome again. Please join me in the book of Genesis, chapter 32, for tonight's Wednesday evening. Let's see, is that being shared? Let's see, just make sure. There we are. Okay, we're just a little slow on the computer end of it, but all good. So again, our sources as we go, Messianic Jewish Rabbi Jonathan Cahn and some of his writings about scriptures and events and some possible connections there. And first and foremost, our primary source is the Word of God and always will be our foundation for everything. Feel free to differ and disagree on anything else that he says, that I say. The Bible is what we look to ultimately, which is where we are starting. So tonight in Genesis 32, 2 verses here, then a couple elsewhere. Genesis 32, verse 9. Jacob is on his way back with his new family, and he's afraid of meeting his brother, so he's having a conversation. Genesis 32, verse 9, Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you." I'll pause right there. Just that introduction, it's just the intro, it's not even the whole sentence yet, but just that verse. Here, Jacob is recognizing at this moment of urgency on his way back home after all these years, 20 plus years he's been gone. He says, recognizing that God is the God of his family, his grandfather Abraham, his father Isaac, and he's pleading with the Lord, reminding the Lord of his call and promise, where God himself said, return to your country and your relatives, and I will prosper you. In other words, come home, which means God has a home where he will prosper us.
Who was he saying that to? I'm sorry, specifically, that was to Abraham?
The promise continues on. Abraham is told, so Sister Ashley asked, who is the promise given to about returning? Yeah. Abraham was given the prophecy that there would be a departure and a return, which happened multiple times, first with Egypt and the Exodus, and then Joshua and bringing them to the promised land, which is the first place they were actually officially settled in the land that was promised to Abraham all those 430 years prior. Here, Jacob is quoting the Lord back to him, where the Lord had a conversation. Jacob had a conversation with the whole Jacob's ladder thing on his way out when he was on the run from his brother Esau, who was wanting to kill him. And he had the dream of the angels ascending and descending in this ladder. And he says, wow, God's here, and I didn't even realize it. So he names the place Bethel, which means house of God. And he makes a vow to God, Lord, if you'll see me through, you're going to be my God, and I'm all in, I'm yours. And so 20 years later, Jacob's coming back now and reminding God of the conversation that he and the Lord had together, where the Lord told Jacob, as was prophesied to Abraham, his grandpa before him, return to me, return to the home I have for you, to your family, and I will bless you. I will prosper you. And this is true of him physically and spiritually with his blood grandpa Abraham, his blood father Isaac. But for us here in the church today, in March of 2022, this is very much a spiritual promise. This church, by our conviction and belief and doctrine, is an extension of the very church Jesus started 2,000 years ago. It's a continuation of that. Just as you can trace a bloodline of Abraham, Christ made the point, don't get too cocky on that, because I can raise from these stones your sons to Abraham. But just as there's a lineage in the Jewish faith, Father Abraham, so too there's a spiritual lineage, not only in our salvation, but us coming to, and this is the whole olive branch thing from Romans 11, we're brought into this lifeline of promise, which will tie into John 15 on Sunday, Jesus talking to his church about being the vine, and they're the branches. So long answer to the question.
Yeah. Sorry.
But it's important stuff.
Well, it's fine.
No, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
So Jacob is recognizing the significance of these promises and this inheritance and this provision. God wants to have a people, which everyone's invited to be a part of, but God wants to have a people. He has a land and he has a promise for the people on his land. And so that's the desire for the return here. And this plays out through the centuries and through thousands of years with the return of Israel in our last century and other things and things to come in the future, especially with their recognition of the Messiah in the end times. So that's one verse. Skip down to verse 28, where God said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." This is after he wrestles with the angel of God overnight, gets his hip knocked out of place, which we saw in that episode of The Chosen. You got a strange God. But anyway, here's God telling him, you're no longer Jacob, you are Israel. He who has striven or worked things out with God. It's an interesting event, an interesting passage. I relate it to Paul telling the Philippians, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. We're saved gloriously as a gift, but what we do with that gift afterwards, the life that we decide as we desire to wrestle out the old self and embrace the new, it's a wrestling, it's a struggle, it's an effort. And so God here in this conversation with Jacob is telling him, you are going to be, this is your name, this is your identity, this is how you're going to be known. The 12 sons will be the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation of Israel, which is those who have struggled, through these things with God and have prevailed, have come out on top. And so very, very significant here that yes, there's a struggle, but as we see God through, we prevail. And that relates to us as spiritual Israel today. Anything on that verse, reactions or questions?
Is there a reason that he changed his name from Jacob to Israel, other than just that he come through this and
That was actually the main reason. So Carol asks, is there a reason for the name change? Yes, the reason is, and you pretty much hit it, it's because this is marking a different focus now. We go for, there are lots of name changes in the Bible. Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, Jacob to Israel. I still call him Jacob sometimes just to clarify, I'm talking about the man, not the nation. But yeah, it's to mean there's something new going forward. Trivia note, Saul's name was never changed to Paul. Saul's just the Hebrew version after he was.
you've got to slow down.
I can do that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I can do that.
My brain is
Yeah.
engaged.
No worries at all. I'm happy to.
Does Ruben say Naomi?
Yeah.
And she changed her name to Mara.
Bitter. Yeah, bitter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mara means
Did
bitter.
that help you? Because she
Yeah.
did. The Lord didn't say your name.
Yeah. Well, that she was expressing how she felt at the moment. Don't even call me that. Don't even call me that, because right now I'm so distraught over what I've been through and what's happened. So she was brokenhearted. She was embittered through those experiences and the loss. I can't imagine losing husband and 2 sons and being away from home and finally being able to come back. And of course, the joy she had at the end, where she was no longer bitter. But yeah, these name changes in the Bible are very significant because they mark a change in focus, a change in direction, a change in attitude, a change in approach. So it's very, very significant, which reminds me, we are told in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation by Jesus himself, we sing a song, new name written down in glory. There are scriptures that talk about we are going to be given a new name. And in Roman times, Greek Olympics and things like that, when someone won, they would be given a white stone that was their pass and entry into the after party, the ceremony celebration, and a name was written on that stone that only they saw and were given. In the Catholic faith I grew up in, when we had our 8th grade confirmation, we chose a name to be confirmed under that wasn't our birth name. Mine was Michael. My stepdad at the time was named Michael. And so names are significant. Name changes are significant. And so very much here with Jacob, God saying, you're going to be Israel now. You're going to be known as the one who has striven through all these things with God right there, and you have prevailed. How many nations have come and gone, especially those who persecuted Israel, yet the nation of Israel still stands? the people still have an identity and still exist. Who's a Babylonian today? So very, very significant, God's work with Jacob and Jacob recognizing God's calling to him into all these things, calling him to his physical as well as spiritual home of his ancestors, his family, wanting him to be a new creation with a new name as a new identity through his new experience, where Jacob originally was the deceiver. Remember, he had, I mean, strange name for a kid, I know, but he had in the womb, and I joke about this, but could be where these things come from, you never know. With his twin brother in the womb, one was Esau was coming out and Jacob grabbed him by the heel. So he pulled his brother's leg. Then later he deceived his father, who is going blind, and by putting on the wool to impersonate his more masculine brother Esau, and faked him out. So he pulled the wool over his dad's eyes. But Jacob actually means to supplant, to take the place of. So he's not taking someone else's place. Now God is changing his name, saying, you've got a place and you've got an identity under me. So very, very significant here. And again, we're being brought into this. What's interesting about this too is there's a Hebrew word in here, moladet, talking about native, returning to the home of your ancestors, returning to the home, your native land. It refers to the place or land of your birth. The land of Israel is the place where the Jewish nation is birthed. When they arrive crossing the Jordan and they settle in the promised land, that is their home. That is their identity, as was given to Abraham in the promise back in Genesis 12, all those generations ago. So go over to chapter 35, one verse, and this relates to that. Genesis 35:12. God tells Jacob as he settles in after all these things. Genesis 35:12, God tells Jacob, the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. So there's the future, there's a promise, there's a hope of something to look forward to. And so this is a homecoming. When someone who's been saved gets baptized and joins the church, it is a spiritual homecoming. Remember 1 Corinthians 12:18, God places the members, each one in the body as he sees fit. So someone coming to join a church, God has placed them in a spiritual home. This is yours. This is where you belong now. This is where you were meant to be the whole time. This is what I have for you. You belong somewhere. You matter. You have a place. And so very important for us as churches to remember that about every single member, current and future. And so last scripture, let's hop over to Exodus chapter 23. Slight refresher here, but important nonetheless. In Exodus 23, just going to look at two verses reminding us about the Sabbath rest. Exodus 23, verses 10 and 11. Swap this out here. There we go. And there we go. Hello, Sister Lou, and welcome. So Exodus 23, here's what the Lord through Moses tells the people how they are to be on the land. Exodus 23, we'll just read the two verses, 10 and 11. Verse 10 of Exodus 23, you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield, but on the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. So, and the question gets asked, how do they live without a harvest? They eat whatever grows naturally of itself without having to actually work it. And the Hebrew word here for what grows by itself is hefker, and that actually means without an owner. And this is really interesting. And I thought about this and let my brain spin on this for a moment. So if no one's working it, it doesn't belong to any individual. It's there for everyone. It doesn't have an owner. Well, ultimately, everything, as we know, is God's. And I think there's a point here to this. The whole earth is God's and all it contains, as Solomon said when he dedicated the temple. Beautiful, gorgeous temple made out of the earth's resources and God-given talent in the crafting. But he says, he's not saying, ta-da, God, look at this great thing we did for you. He's saying, it's all yours anyway. Basically, and this relates to the Jubilee as well, when the land reverts to the original tribes every 50 years, it's a reminder that ultimately the land is God's. We are merely renters. We can buy homes and everything, but ultimately in this life, we are renters on this planet. And it's a beautiful thing because God's the one who provides it for us. We're told in Isaiah, the earth was created for habitation. And we know how uniquely the earth is fashioned. Nowhere in the universe have we found anywhere that can support life like the earth, and how fragile in place it is. All the science behind one little thing off here, there goes life on the planet, but God preserves it. So with this idea of rest here in that 7th year and what gets produced not having an owner, it does have an owner. It's the Lord. He is the one who owns what is produced of the earth that he owns for the people that are his own, in the land that is his own. So it's a great reminder, and the purpose for these things is to bring us back to God, understand his perspective on things, that he is the author and finisher of our faith, of our life, and our life is truly to be at its most fulfilled, found in him. As Jacob, through all his shenanigans with his family, you can all read about that in those in-between chapters, but Jacob finally coming home spiritually as well as other ways, to where God has for him the whole time. And so it's a very important aspect for us to know that we are where the Lord has for us to be, that we are at the home he has for us, and that we're making our physical households a home. Yeah, we know the famous Joshua slogan, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, that kind of thing. Very important to have that place of identity, that place of refuge, that place of rest. This is a place the Lord has established. In fact, it's said in the Psalms, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. And so unless the Lord's the watchman, then those who try to watch, keep watch uselessly. So it's a great position to find ourselves under his care, looking to his provision and thriving in the life he provides for us. So those are the thoughts from those verses. Anything else from anyone on those? Okay, so let's move on. I actually have an answer or two to a question from last time. Let's see. First up, remember from last week, the Lincoln Cathedral. Quick reminder, the Lincoln Cathedral replaced the Great Pyramid of Giza after 3,700 years as now the new tallest structure. And it held that record for 237 years until its spire collapsed. Question was asked by my sweetie, well, what caused that? I didn't know then, but I know now because I looked it up. The Lincoln Cathedral's lead encased spire eventually becomes vulnerable due to rotting. And it collapses under high winds during a severe storm, 1548. And so now that leaves the Tower of St. Mary's Church in Stralsund, Germany, the tallest structure. Until something happens. And I misspoke last time too. Bells of St. Mary's, I think, was in the 1940s, not 1930s, the Bing Crosby movie. That has nothing to do with this church, but I want to keep my facts straight. So what happened with the bell tower at St. Mary's? Well, slightly different story here. St. Mary's Church Tower held the record for 99 years until in 1647, it was struck by lightning and burned down. And so then the Strasbourg Cathedral surpassed it. So that's what happened to the bell tower at St. Mary's. And they just built this dome thing instead in its place.
Well, the reason I asked that is because I was wondering if, by off chance, the destruction or the failure of those buildings was during a Jubilee year or
Yeah.
Shemitah year, or, just because, some of them, even though they were churches, their opulence does seem somewhat vain.
Yeah, and there is that balance.
Yeah.
Are we glorying in what we look, Lord, the great magnificent thing we've done for you? There can be some of that human pride, replacing the humility and gratefulness for God's provision of the ability to bless them, as back to Solomon's prayer. Yeah, it brings us up to this guy now.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry. That was funny. That was really funny. Which makes me feel better, because honestly, preparing for this class, I'm gonna have a moment here with my church. I was actually feeling a little sad. I was honestly feeling a little sad about the things I was going to be presenting. Not to be a downer or anything, but just we're coming out of the golden age. We're flashing back in time a little bit before World War I here. It's actually in 1848 when Karl Marx and Frederick Engels write the Communist Manifesto. So a little bit before the Civil War that this is written. And what saddens me is this is coming off of the Gilded Age. Great time, Grover Cleveland, where there's great prosperity and great effort to take care of people and provide for the masses, mass production, lower prices, all those kind of things. Things became more available and accessible than ever before. We were working with what God gave us, and it was blessing, and we weren't doing it at a cost to the God-given individual. And that's my issue with this thing here. And I want to be very, very intentional that I don't get distracted, which there's great potential for. I don't want to go off in areas that aren't necessary and that aren't relevant to where we're going, and that take the focus off of the spiritual, which is why we're here in the first place. This is a Bible study. We are to be looking at biblical concepts. So if ever I get too lost in the weeds, feel free to rein me in, say, hey, Brother Eric, what's the spiritual point to all this? And if I don't have one, I'll shut up and get back to one. If there is one, I'll remember to say it, and not just assume you all know it, or that I've said it, but maybe I haven't. So Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, Marxism. What's this all about? Well, to quote from the Communist Manifesto itself, quote, "The theory of communism may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property," which is not a sentence. So that's what you get with a public school education. But anyway, did I say that? Also, abolition of the family. That's in there. Oh yeah. Where do you think BLM got it? Abolition of the family.
Wow.
That's a quote from the Communist Manifesto.
God instituted families.
Yeah.
Right. So it's anti-God then.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
We replace, and that's what saddens me. We replace home education by social. So the whole thing with socialism, one branch is communism. The whole point of all of this is, and this is what will usher in what's called in history books the progressive era. What defines progressive? Progress, moving away from our spiritual foundation as a nation. Because we're not just talking about Israel, we're talking about America, and striving to be a spiritual Israel, as we saw very much the scriptures were on the hearts of our founders of this very nation. I mean, it's just rich with that. And so we see a departure here. Now he's over here in Germany, but it makes its way across the ocean over to us, and we'll see that. But the whole idea again of the progressive era that will tie into these things we were just looking at in the 1920s into the 30s with the crash and the depression that follows, it's all related. This departure from God and the things of God. This is very much an intentional break from God. This is the elevation of man, progress away from what? Away from godly foundation, the godly instituted family, the godly, divinely made individual, and so this is my thing on it. Here's a quote from me, because I just wrote this down in my notes here. Any approach whose foundation starts with division, resentment, and not respecting the sanctity of God-given individual life and all that comes with it, that approach is godless and evil from the start. Reagan got flack for calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. The reason he did so is because he recognized he wasn't calling the people godless and evil. He was recognizing the institution, the mindset, the attitude, the approach, the goals were contrary, they were in opposition to God. And therefore, yes, evil. Now, a lot of good people can see good attributes and desire good applications of these things. The problem is something that starts bad very rarely ends good. And so this approach has been tried a gazillion places all over the earth since the inception, never worked anywhere. And there's a reason for that. We've seen in these scriptures where God says, I'm going to make you prosper. Stay with me, be rooted in me, grounded in me, have the values that I have, because God values the family, God values the individual, God values the church. We value these things, we will be blessed. And this is what he started with Abraham. He called him, and he was a family. He said, I'm going to give you a son of promise, Isaac. And from there, I'm going to give you a faith. The Jews pride themselves on Abraham, father of our faith. We in the New Testament are called children of Abraham, walking in the steps of the faith of Abraham. So there's a faith, there's family, but it also starts with that individual calling. So the individual matters greatly to God. And therefore, if we are people of God, what matters to God needs to matter to us. And so the whole point of socialism, communism is class warfare or other types of warfare, drawing lines of division and separation and creating hostility, resentment, animosity. There's nothing godly in that. Sister Minnie.
Well, I work a lot in basic breaking this. I can tell you, let's start with the right numbers. When you're adding it up, you're never going to balance. You're never going to have balance if you don't start with the right numbers.
Amen.
And what God gave us was right. When you go away from that and then go with something else, you're never going to balance.
Yeah, how is that going to work for us? Not very well.
Well, in the Bible, a lot of times, especially Paul, we talk about counting things, or counting this, count that.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't mean just counting it like, okay,
Right.
I'll put it down. It means actually counting.
You reckon? You reckon?
Oh, yes. When he said reckon, that's the same thing. He's talking about adding it up in your columns. When God counts Jesus' righteousness for us, he puts it in our column.
So they're reconciled.
Yes.
And we are to be reconciled to God and each other. Yeah. There's a point to all these things.
So
Yeah.
then if this is stated implicitly in the manifesto,
Yeah.
why would something like that catch on?
People don't read it.
Why would something like, is that the hook? How do you go from freedom and liberty
Mhm.
to strife and division?
How long have you been in the church?
you know.
I say that half jokingly, yes.
Somebody else will take care of it.
And human nature. And keep in mind, here's where this really comes from. I'm going to put it this way. Marx and Engels were bums. they were not productive members of society. They were living off of other people's money from the get-go. That's why they had time to write this nonsense. And so what happens is it goes back to whether it is Cain and Abel or other examples, and then Jesus gives some parables as well, where someone is productive with what God's given them and someone is not. And therefore there is jealousy, resentment, strife. And so it's not, hey, I'm happy for you and I'm inspired by you and I'm going to do what with the talents God's given me and I'm going to go do over here. When Jesus tells the parable of those who were given like 5 talents, and a talent is a weight, a measure of precious metal, gold or silver. So you're given so much gold, you're given a little bit less, you're given a little bit less. They weren't competing against each other. They did with what they were given, and they were both received by God, each one who did with what they were given. And so that's the issue is, what the issue is here. Under God, God very much works in a meritocracy, where what are you doing with what you've been given? Now, we don't earn our salvation, but faith without works is dead. Sister Minnie.
And there's a saying, those who've been given much, from much required.
Amen. Absolutely. Great quote from Jesus. To whom much is given, much is required. Absolutely. So this is the ideology of resentment. How long had Satan been eyeballing that throne before he made his move? Yeah, it all starts somewhere. So let's bring this to America. Let's not, but already done. So let's look at America. During this era of the progressivism, President Theodore Roosevelt, President in 1901, 42 years old at president. After he was vice president, then McKinley got shot, and now he's president. Here's a quote from Mr. Theodore Roosevelt. Personal property is subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it. Something's wrong with that picture.
The right of eminent domain.
Yeah, but that's not really, I mean, that's the excuse and the legal justification, but that is trampling on God-given rights. Remember the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Well, if we're created equal, then what's the striving for? You do with what you've got, I do with what I've got. If someone's in need, we help each other voluntarily. And so we take care of each other in our local communities, et cetera, et cetera. His statement here was that the God-given individual, if you have a right to your freedom of conscience and these things Brother Butler was talking about in the earlier Sunday morning classes, if you have these liberties, it includes a right to the fruits of your labor. Abe Lincoln made the point, well, shouldn't the guy who works the corn be able to eat the corn? That was a famous Lincoln quote. But here, Mr. Roosevelt says, no, personal property is subject to whatever the community wants to regulate and how much the public welfare may require it. Sorry, you worked hard for that, but yoink. In other words, there's no God in any of that. And who decides? Who makes that choice? Sorry, this person needs it more than you, so this is the notion of the forgotten man, where person A says, and I may have the letters mixed up in how it's actually done, but basically the idea is person A says, I'm going to take from person B and give to person C. Well, you didn't ask person B about that. They're kind of the forgotten man in this equation.
Roosevelt was, not like that.
Oh, no, he was very much like that.
I mean, I don't know. I've never studied this president.
Oh, yeah. Abe Lincoln was the gateway to big government. He
Right.
burst through the gate and paved the way for Wilson. In fact, you can read a lot of this in a book by Judge Andrew Napolitano called Theodore and Woodrow, which we're going to quote from here in a bit. But again, and I want to make sure I don't get too lost in weeds and distracted from the spiritual. This is going contrary to God, contrary to how our nation was established. Because The basic question is, if we started with a good foundation spiritually under God and we saw the blessings of it as a nation, unlike any other on earth, why are we where we are now? And if we can learn and identify what happened and when, we can at least do our part in our own lives to hold fast to what matters. Of course, we in the church already know the answers. Stick close to God, everything else sorts itself out. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom, everything else will be added. So that's the short answer, and we get that. So how did our nation slip away from it? Well, we've always had highs and lows, just like, we're all sin infected. So we all have our highs and lows in our life and walk and spiritual journey. But a noticeable change happened in the beginning of the 1900s, the 20th century, with this progressive era. And Teddy was a big part of it. Does that mean he did everything wrong? No, he did some good things, of course.
Republican or
Yes,
Democrat?
he was Republican until, I'm so glad you asked that. So Sister Ashley asks, was he, we'll keep losing that thing. Sister Ashley asks, was he a Republican or Democrat? He was a Republican at first. So he served a term as Republican president. His vice president, William Howard Taft, becomes the next president. Well, some issues happen. So we're gonna do some storytelling now, courtesy of Mr. Judge Andrew Napolitano. But this requires a field trip to a place familiar to my family, known as Jekyll Island. It all starts with a secret meeting on Jekyll Island. So for the uninitiated, we are in Georgia. Here is Jekyll Island. And just up to the top here, past the South, there's Savannah, where my sweetie was born. And just past the top over here, we've got Hilton Head Island, where our daughter was born. Right above that, we got Beaufort, where Ashley and I met. Then you've got exciting places like Hardyville and Pooler off to the side here. Well, depends on your definition. So Jekyll Island right here, November of 1910, there's a meeting that happens here, a secret meeting. So what's this all about? What does our good friend Judge Napolitano have to say about all this and share with us? Let's look at some pictures first. Okay, water park, sure. Yeah. Wrap around porch. Sea turtles? Yeah. Water park, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to that one happy picture. There we go. Okay, we'll look at a happy picture while we tell a sad story or a story of intrigue, excitement. Ooh, so what happens here? And why do I keep losing that? There we go. Okay, so here's the tale that Judge Andrew Napolitano tells. At the dawn of the 20th century, Wall Street, remember Wall Street, New York City and all that stuff? Wall Street is losing power in the banking industry. Powerhouses like JP Morgan and the Rockefellers are losing significant market share to the new banks arising in the West. Wall Street is bleeding power and money. Wall Street needs the government to help it devise a way to capture the market once more and put an end to these smaller banks. Heaven forbid we have competition and free trade and all that stuff. So what happens in November of 1910, in the dark of night, undercover, a cast of characters largely unknown today meets in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia, November of 1910. This all-male group includes Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, who is the Senate Republican whip, Abraham Piatt Andrews, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, so important, Frank A. Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, which is now Citibank. We've got who he represents, John D. Rockefeller, as well as the International Investing House of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. We've also got Henry P. Davidson, senior partner of JP Morgan Company, We've got Benjamin Strong, head of JP Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And we've got Paul W. Warbug, a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, who as well represents those financial titans, the Rothschild family. Get this, these few men here I've just named off, together, they represent 1/4 of the entire world's wealth in 1910. Yeah. So this handful of guys are meeting in secret. So what do? Why? If the truth of their rendezvous is exposed to the world, their master plan will certainly be defeated. In a quest for global dominance, these few men conspire with each other to form an otherwise illegal cartel through a partnership of government and banking. They travel under cover of darkness. They don disguises. They use fake names. They ride in Senator Aldrich's personal train car, which is attached to a train going from Hoboken, New Jersey, down to Jekyll Island. Don't know how many people in Hoboken are wanting to go to Jekyll Island, but anyway. Well, this train car that belongs to the senator, what they do is they wait till all the other passengers on the train board, and then once they're all settled and not looking, then this other train car is hitched up in the back, and that's where these men are. So oblivious. Everyone else is oblivious to this. So the train goes down and they do the same thing, let them get off the train and then take care of those folks. So no one even knew this was happening. So they come together and they draft plans for a little thing called the Federal Reserve. So we're going to talk a little bit about how things work, kind of wrap things up here. And why this matters. So we know in a God-given free liberty place, as I mentioned last time, hey, you got something I'm interested in? Is there a price you're willing to sell it for, a price I'm willing to pay for it? Cool, we agree, we're both happy, we walk away. You're happy with the money in exchange, I'm happy for what I purchased in exchange. No one else was involved, end of story. We both come out better for it. Well, things used to be done with a gold standard, meaning there was substance to what was being done. Everything had a value, and there's only so much gold to go around. So it was precious, it had its limits. So there are limits to what we could do based on the limit of the gold we had. And so it got kind of a pain and not the safest thing to be lugging around gold. So we had paper IOUs, printed money. And basically, if you bought something from me, you gave me paper money, I could take this to the bank and get the gold that is representing.
Actually, promissory notes.
Promissory notes, yes.
That's what they were.
So basically
An IOU, yep. And if you play the board game Life, it's got promissory notes in it. Yes, exactly.
She said that on
Yep, exactly. It's a note of promise. So far, so good. But here's what banks would do. You put your money, your gold in the bank, and they would loan it out. Now, it became a tricky thing because they had to balance how much gold to hang on to in case people wanted to come and claim it versus how much they could loan out. But if they didn't loan out as much, then they weren't making as much money themselves on the interest they were charging on what they were loaning out. So what they needed was something called a lender of last resort. When all else fails, someone who will bail them out, so that then they could take these riskier loans and, hopefully get that interest off of them. That is the Federal Reserve. So before then, they had to be wise and careful with what they did. Now they can be reckless because the Federal Reserve will bail them out. So that's the banks. What about the government side? Well, the government and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve do back and forth exchanges where nothing of value actually changes hands. But the government says, hey, full faith and credit of the United States, which is taxpayers. And then the Federal Reserve says, great, here's a check representing no real money. So this is going back and forth, just creating more debt on us, basically. And so what happens is more money gets printed where there's not more gold being generated. So a dollar isn't worth as much gold as it used to be because you got more dollars than you do gold. So money is losing its value, but the banks don't care because they're earning interest, getting interest payments. So it's a win for them. And so when we see things, this is called inflation, which we're experiencing a little of right now. This is exactly what's happening right now. We're having inflation because is that jar of cookies really more valuable now than it was before? No, the jar of cookies hasn't changed. What's happened? The dollar is less valuable. It takes more dollars to buy the same thing than it did before. So it's not that this jar of cookies is magically more valuable. It hasn't changed, but it takes more dollars to pay for it now because the dollars mean less now. So that's what the Federal Reserve does. And so two folks who are very much in favor of this whole shenaniganing process are Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. So there's a problem though. Taft is president. He's not hip to this. He's not cool with this. So they need to get Taft out. So in the election of 1912, what do? Hey, Teddy, you know you missed the big leagues, right? Well, guess what? We'll get behind you. We'll back you. So Teddy Roosevelt starts a new party. He leaves the Republicans, starts the Progressive Party, nicknamed Bull Moose. And so JP Morgan convinces Teddy Roosevelt, and so he runs for president, splits off just enough votes from Taft to where Woodrow Wilson can slide in as president, which is what the bankers wanted the whole time. And also, by the way, in this election, socialist Eugene Debs got 901,500 votes. So yeah, socialism's on the rise. But most of the banks are not national banks. They're regional banks, and they've got their assets there. Another quick thing, most businesses didn't live off of bank loans. They financed through themselves and each other. But because the banks could now count on the Federal Reserve to bail them out, they could artificially lower the interest rates and make businesses an offer they couldn't refuse with such a low interest rate. So now they became dependent on the banks. But that's okay because the Federal Reserve will bail them out. No one's too big to fail, right? And so but here's the thing, they can't look like they're doing it. So they fake a grassroots movement starting in the Midwest. And they use the academics, they use the media to make it sound like, hey, this is a groundswell coming from the people. And so sure enough, 1913, Congress passes the Federal Reserve Act. President Wilson signs it after he wins the election and immediately starts printing money and using it to help support the war effort in World War I. And Woodrow Wilson actually writes, recognizing the Federal Reserve Act is a huge mistake. He's quoted as saying, "I've unwittingly ruined my country." But he knew what he was doing. So sad story, but look at the happy picture.
So what does that have to do with the Bible?
So great question. What does that have to do with the Bible?
Bring you back around.
Absolutely.
Down into the weeds and all that history.
Exactly. So what this has to do with the Bible is, where's God in this picture? This is a departure from substance and value. This is a case of running wild with printing money when it has no substance to back it up. It's a lie. And so this is what causes bubbles. And what goes up must come down. So if you stick with godly principles, do things based on a foundation, based on substance, in a financial example, stick with the gold standard and don't print more dollars than you have gold for. Don't write checks you can't cash kind of thing. Then if you stick with doing things of value that have substance to back them up, then you're on a sure foundation, then you're safe from all the calamities that happen. This is what brings on the calamities that never had to happen. The idea of the Federal Reserve was sold that we're going to prevent things from happening. Well, it didn't prevent the Great Depression, it caused it by its dealings with the Bank of England, which we'll get to. Sister Minnie.
And the Bible says, don't use false weights.
Amen. Leviticus.
That's what they were doing. They were using a false weight.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
That's why it was wrong. Because it was false value. They were doing.
Exactly. And so it was contravening, going against godly principles in their actions. And it was an intentional and actual joyful thing. We're going to conspire together and build this society up in our own image. Tower of Babel. Wall Street, New York Stock Exchange, this is all becoming its own Tower of Babel, where we're elevating man, and man knows better than God and what's moral and right and ethical and honest. We can wheel and deal and shenanigate and make our own way of doing things, and we'll call it good. And it's a recipe for disaster, and it has been every time. Pretty much every financial economic catastrophe has been man-made. And a lot of the timing of it ends up falling into the godly timing of the Shemitahs and Jubilees, and we'll see that.
I've seen a lot of documentaries like on the Rockefellers and JP Morgan and Rothschilds.
Yep.
Rothschild, all those people.
Yep.
And it seems like they're these, pillar type families, but there's a lot of weird stuff and shady stuff, going on.
Who's making those things?
Exactly.
Yeah. There's,
Who's the source?
it's can't all be okay.
No,
Right.
Going back to the people trying to build themselves up and then get right down.
Yeah.
What was it that Satan told Eve?
Did God really say?
He knows that when you do that, you're gonna be as smart as he is. These people think they were as smart as God.
Yeah. All men are created equal.
Yeah.
Meaning, yeah. I mean, we have different talents and abilities, but equal in value to God. Nothing about your talents and abilities, which came from God anyway, give you the right to mess with my life. Don't tread on me. And nothing gives me the right to do that to you. You live your life under your God-given conviction, and I will live mine under my God-given conviction, and we will mutually respect each other.
Well, they want everyone else to be accountable, but they don't want to be accountable
Mhm.
to God. But they want us to be accountable to them.
Let's collude together. Let's conspire together. Come, one world in Babel. Let's agree together. God said to spread out and be diverse. Yes, God is actually interested in diversity. It's a good thing when it's under God. And all the multiculturalism, God invented that. He wanted all these cultures to spread out and enjoy their different ways of doing things. It's a beautiful thing. But man said, no, let's come together. Let's conspire together. Let's build things up in our own image and become our own society of man. And let's progress away, move on up away from the foundation of God and what he called us to do and what he lays out the promises that Jacob was coming home to. No, let's go our own way. Let's progress away from God. Never works. And what's the attraction? Well, I'm jealous or envious because someone's got something I don't, or maybe they worked hard to get it, or I didn't, I let my circumstances be an excuse. I like the idea of being able to be a victim, or I just don't like that God takes away my excuses. I don't like the fact that God has things for me to do and I'm being told I don't have to do them, that I have a cause to complain about. So I would rather complain and cry this cause than take godly responsibility for myself and not compare myself with the Joneses and just live the life God has for me to live. So that's a lot of that human nature, that sin-infected nature. Yeah. And if I can progress away from God and I'm accepted in this as a cog in this wheel of the state or this society of man, then hey, that makes me feel pretty good because hey, we're all in agreement together. We're going to do this thing, and we're not going to use that three-letter word called sin. You never hear that word mentioned amongst these folks. There's a reason. And because we want to progress away, oh, that was back then. That was back in the day. That's the old timers. You know, we don't want to be stuck in the past. We want a living constitution. We want to be a living, moving society, moral relativism. Hey, whatever morals were good for them back then, that's great for them. We want to live it today. And whatever folks live after us, if they want to totally disregard us, we'll be dead. We won't care. That's on them. But do what feels good today. Did you have something?
I'm not sorry. I think I lost the thread of it. It's just that after when you said that they did things their way, that's fine. But actually, today is all about condemning them, what they did
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah, they can't. You're right. They-
So bad.
Right. They can't even say, "Well, hey, I'm happy that worked for them, but now is now." That's what they were saying in the progressive era. Nowadays, they're trying to take it out, root and stem. So they have to sour it and condemn it.
You never say it was all
Mhm.
bad. It's all bad.
Exactly. They have to taint it. Exactly. To justify, because there are some of us saying, hey, like Jesus says about wine, he says, old wine and new wineskins. You want new wine and new wineskins so that it stretches with it, so that when it's matured, you recognize you've seen the growth and development start to finish, and you go, hey, this is good. In fact, Jesus says in Luke, when he gives the parable, no man having the old wishes for the new, because the old is good enough. It's matured, it's developed, it's stood the test of time. And so there has to be something drastic done to overturn that. And that's where that godless evil effort is coming from. A desire to do exactly that, where those like us recognize whatever you think about government, all that, and make some money, that's the lesser point. Those are just illustrations and real life examples. The heart of the matter is spiritual approach to life and going in a godless direction or a godly founded one. And we see the difference. Anytime something comes up, ask the question, where is God in this picture? Where is the value, the substance in the word of God in this picture? So that's what it matters. That's what got strayed from, but that's what we cling to. So with that, anything else from anyone else? If not, we'll go ahead and call it a night for class and get ready to close in our season of prayer. Stop the share and stop the recording.